Hey, this is Shane with Timber Biscuit Woodworks, and today we're going to build this modern bread box using some more traditional techniques as well as some more modern ones. So let's go ahead and get started. And since I'm future Shane, let's go ahead and meet past Shane at the miter saw where I'm breaking down some lumber. And for this one, I'll be using walnut and hard maple to give the box some contrast. Now, I don't have lumber that's quite wide enough, but I do have some 5/4, so I'm going to go ahead and resaw all these pieces at the bandsaw to create some book match panels. Doing this also allows me to camouflage the glue seam, as well as emphasize some of the nicer grain pattern. I'm sure there's a ton of tips I could share to resawing successfully at the bandsaw, but one of the biggest ones would be to use a nice featherboard and just take it slow. Then you can resaw really large pieces like this one. And if you're still having trouble, check out my video on the bandsaw tune-up. So right off the bandsaw, the boards were still a little thick, so I thicknessed them down to a 1/2 inch at the planer, and took them over to the joiner to clean up one edge. And if you'd like to build this bread box for yourself, I'll have plans for this project linked in the description below. So once I jointed one edge of all my boards, I took them over to the table saw to clean up the opposite side. And because these panels are going to be book matches, I want to make sure that I take material away from the outside edge of my panels. This way I don't cut into my book match and mess up that grain pattern in the center. For the larger back panel as well as the shelves, I don't worry too much about the book match. I just want to make sure that I have 3 nice clean boards, since you really won't be able to see them too much. From there, it was time to glue up all 6 panels. And being that they're so small, there's really no need for any dominoes or anything like that. I just make sure not to clamp down hard enough to insert a bow into the pieces, and then use an F-style clamp to apply some opposite pressure. If you do run into issues with your panels bowing or warping, try adding a few coals to hold things flat. I think the most important thing is to have a nice flat reference surface, so I like to push against the parallel clamp to make sure the boards stay nice and flat. So from there, I just repeated the process a few more times until I had all 6 panels. After about 15 minutes, I could remove any excess glue squeeze out with a dull chisel. And once the glue was dry, I removed the boards from the clamps and used a card scraper to smooth out the glue seam. This is a faster way than sanding to remove that uneven edge, and then from there I took out any high spots on the boards using a number 4 smoothing plane. Once I felt like all of my panels were pretty flat, I went ahead and finished them off with some 180 grit sandpaper. Alright, so now that all the panels are glued up and cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and lay out all of my parts, and then I'm going to cut them out a little oversized so that I can plane back to them and get them just right. So let's get these laid out and get on to cutting out some parts. But first I needed to take a quick detour over to the CNC to pick up my template. And don't worry, like Toby, Andrew, and Tom and Spider-Man, we'll all make it to the same timeline soon. Spoiler. Alright, so now that I have my template, I could go ahead and mark it out on my panels, as well as lay out all the other parts. While this step isn't 100% necessary, I feel like it's the best way to get the grain orientation I'm looking for. Plus it gives me a little reassurance when I'm making the cuts for real. Back at the table saw, I started ripping down my pieces. I like starting with my rip cuts first and then working my way back to the cross cuts. And what this does is it allows for me to have a nice clean edge to reference against my fence when I'm making those cross cuts. Here I am leaving my boards a little wide so that I can plane back to the exact width later on. And for the majority of this project, I'm using these new blades by Harvey called the Destroyer blades. And full disclosure, they sent these over for me to try out, but I've been really impressed by them, so I would say check them out. I'll have a link in the description. So with my pieces all ripped down, I went ahead and cross-cut one clean edge onto each of the sides. This gives me a square edge to work off of for my miter gauge here in a second. And I like doing this process at my table saw sled because it allows me to sneak up to the edge of the board a little easier. Once I had all the clean edges, I swapped in my miter gauge. Here I'm going to cut all the interior pieces the exact same length. This way I don't have any issues with any of my tenons being too long or any of my boards being too wide. This also has the added benefit of all the boards being the exact same width. So if my measurements are off even slightly, they're going to be off exactly the same across all the boards. With that said, the only board that I couldn't do that with is the back panel. So I went ahead and marked that out and then cut it down with a crosscut sled. And if you're enjoying this project, hit the like button. It allows the video to spread to more people and really helps me out a ton. Thanks. Alright, so with all my straight cuts done, I brought the curved side panels over to the bandsaw to rough cut them out. And I know this wide resaw blade isn't the right blade for cutting curves, but these are some pretty easy curves, so it wasn't worth the hassle of swapping it out. So I try to cut these pieces to an 1/8 inch from the line. And just a heads up, if you don't have a bandsaw, you could absolutely cut these out with a jigsaw. But if you do have a bandsaw, keep a waste bin close by, because scraps. Though I guess that does remove the opportunity to chuck them across the shop while you holler Kobe. Anywho. To attach the templates, I'm using a few strips of double-sided tape. I also threw in a couple of 1/2 inch offcuts to avoid any bowing that might occur when pressing the template against the bearing. Oh, and the plans will have full-scale templates for those who don't have a CNC. And if you do have one, it'll have that file in there too. From there, I set the height of my flush trim bit and began routing around the template. For template routing like this, where the grain is running in a few different directions, these compression bits really work well to avoid tear out. They are a little pricey, but the cost makes up for itself in the fact that they last a long time and they prevent a lot of errors. And for me, that makes them worth the price of admission. Once the template routing is complete, I'm going to leave the template attached to my workpiece. This way I can use those pre-cut grooves to cut in my mortises. To cut the mortises, I'm going to use a plunge router and a 1/2 inch guide bushing with a 1/4 inch downcut bit. So once I have the depth set to a 1/4 inch, I could go ahead and start plunging my mortises. Now I designed this template to make sure that the mortises had equal space around each tenon, so plunging them is pretty straightforward. The one thing I'd say is make sure you take your time and plunge all the way down so that you don't have too many inconsistencies in the depth of your mortise. And that's not always the case, so I'll address those with the router plane later on. Around the edges, I was careful to pull the router towards the inside of the template to make sure I don't bow out those edges and ultimately change the shape of the mortise. This is one of those all or nothing type of scenarios, because if the router gets squirrely here, then I have to start back over on these panels. So I really made sure to pay attention and not screw these up. Kind of like you might be if you're not subscribed. So subscribe and let's keep getting better together. And thank you for your support. Alright, so with all my mortises cut, I could go ahead and start squaring off all the rounded corners left by my router bit. And to do that, I'll just use a few chisels, mainly my 1/4 inch. I start by notching out my top and then taking away material off the two sides before going back and removing the last bit of material. Doing my best to keep those corners square and even. Now, alternatively, you could leave these rounded over and then round over the tenons. I just prefer this method for this large of a tenon. In any case, this does take a little while, so just put on your favorite record and like the cars, let the good times roll. So once all my rounded edges were cleaned up, I used a router plane to flatten out the bottoms of the mortises. This allows for the tenons to sit flush across the entire mortise. Alright, so next up I have all of my tenons to cut, but you'll recall that I left these long, so I'm going to go ahead and plane them back to the final dimensions before I cut the tenons. This way, when I'm fitting things together, I don't have some pieces that are a little too wide or a little too short and parts where, I'll have to correct them later. So let's get these planed down to their final dimension, and then I will go ahead and cut out the tenons. When I'm working with larger pieces, I really don't feel the need to plane back to a specific dimension, but with smaller projects, the tolerances are so small that I really feel like planing back your pieces allows for a much better fit. Plus, any excuse I get to use hand tools these days, I generally go for. Alright, so next it was on to cutting the tenons. And I used a setup block to get pretty close to my tenon height and then go test out the fit. And once I had that fit nailed, I went ahead and cut all the tenons for all of my pieces. This is another one of those times where I opt for the miter gauge rather than the sled, just because it allows me to really dial in that tenon height and then make micro adjustments if I need to. Once I had my face cheeks cut, I could cut my edge cheeks. And I'm using the same setup on my miter gauge, only this time holding the pieces vertically and adjusting my blade height to fit the width of the mortise, which all should be the same since that's how I designed the template. The only changes really being the middle shelves, which give it a little bit of a shorter tenon to offset the space for the back panel. In any case, what we're looking for here is a nice snug fit, but nothing that's going to take a ton of pressure to fit in. And again, to cut those center shelves, I just take the measurement directly off the piece. And I've said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. I always try to measure off the piece I'm actually working on rather than relying on the plans. And that doesn't go for every single situation, but a lot of times dimensions change throughout the process of a build, so I try my best to adapt to those and get the best fit that I possibly can. And as you can see here, that usually works out alright. So at this point my tenons are pretty darn close, but I want to clean up the shoulders and cheeks using a shoulder plane, just to clean up the fit a little bit. Dado blades can leave some irregularities in the shoulders and cheeks. Another thing that can occur is that the shoulders have a little taper to them, and using a plane like this flattens those out. So once I'm happy with the shoulders and cheeks, I like to use a chisel to make sure that my shoulders are cleaned up, and then clean up the tenon length with a block plane. Just make sure to chamfer your leading edge a little bit so you don't blow out the end of your tenon. Once I repeated that process for all my tenons, I could finally dry fit everything together and see how we were doing. And thankfully, everything fit together like it should. Alright, so next I wanted to round over a couple of the exposed edges on the box. This will soften those edges up and flow better with the curved design of the sides. There are a few parts where I chose not to round over, and that was mainly to get better seams at transition parts, like where the door meets the middle shelf. When I'm being selective like this, I'm always really careful to label my parts well so that I don't accidentally round over a piece I didn't intend to. Now, speaking of the door, it was finally time to cut it to size. And again, I'm going off the measurement of my box, and I'm taking away equal amounts off either side of my door to make sure that that book match stays in the center. From there, I'll go back to my number 4 to plane the door to a perfect fit. Next, I use my crosscut sled to sneak up to the door height. And if you're curious about this sled, I made a video on it a while back called 5 woodshop upgrades for under $100 if you want to build one for yourself. The last part to ensure a good fit was to rip an 81-degree bevel onto the bottom where the hinges will meet the door. Then I could test the fit before cutting in the hinges. And honestly, right now it's a little snug, but that's okay because once the hinges are attached, I can plane it back a little bit more. To mark out the hinges, I applied some double stick tape to the bottom of the hinge and then attached it to the bottom of the door. Then using a marking knife, I marked all around the hinge before popping it off and then darkening those marks with a pencil. I love using this technique to lay out parts because then I'm not relying on measurements alone. It's always better to reference off the physical item whenever you get a chance. And I gotta say, these hinges are really well made, so I'll leave a link to them down in the description below. So once I had everything laid out, I reinforced those marks with my chisel, and then cut back to those lines to give myself a little notch to know where to stop. This is essentially the same process you would do when laying out joinery. Back at the table saw, I cut another 81-degree bevel on a wider board to give myself more surface area for the router base. Then using a downcut bit set to the depth of my hinge, I hogged out the majority of the material. And hey, if you have any questions about these processes, let me know down in the comments, or just say what's up. I reply to every comment I get, so fire away. From there, I could use my chisels to clean up the remaining parts. Again, here I'm just nibbling away at the edges until I get a nice fit for the hinge. It's definitely better to take smaller bites at this, rather than taking large chunks and overshooting the fit. So once the hinge had a nice snug fit, I pre-drilled a couple holes and then used the steel screw to cut into threads. Then I could replace that with the brass one, and then repeat that process 3 times. Again, that's another cool feature about these hinges is they come with this steel screw, so you don't have to worry about ruining your brass screws tapping threads. Though I will say I just about stripped my steel screw, so just be careful. Because like Jet Li, there is only one. Then finally I could reassemble the box and test out the door. Wow. Thanks, Owen. From there I disassembled everything and sanded the box to 180, but I'll save you having to watch all that. Alright, so next we're going to work on the small boxes that go on the top and the drawer pulls. But first I need to cut some vents into the back panels so that there's some airflow and our bread doesn't get all moldy and nasty. So let's cut those out and we'll get this thing wrapped up. To lay out the rear vents, I just split the difference between the shelves. And to be honest with you, prior to this project, I did not know that bread even needed airflow. So the more you know. Now, rather than reinventing the wheel, I already had the template that I used to cut the mortises, so I just reused the width for the center shelf mortise. The main difference here being that these are through cuts. So I did them in 2 passes of 1/4 inch each. And I also put a sacrificial board under my workpiece so that I didn't route into the bench. And if you'd like to support the channel, I'd invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes for project plans and other merchandise, plus some other fun stuff. So check out the link down in the description, and thank you again to all those who've already joined. Alright, so with the back panel having some smoke and exhaust, I turned my focus to the drawer boxes, which I thicknessed down to 1/4 inch before bringing over to the table saw and ripping to their final height. And I'm using maple for the sides and walnut for the bottom to, again, play off that contrast, and I think that'll look pretty cool. So once I had the boxes ripped to the height that I wanted, I used my meter gauge to cut them to the final length. Here I'm kind of keeping track of where these boards go in the grain pattern so that I can reassemble them in the proper manner and keep that flowing grain pattern across the front of the drawers and across the bottoms. From there I cut rabbets onto the front, backs, and bottom of the drawers for assembly. Just make sure that when you're doing this step, you're either using a flat bottom blade or a dado stack like I am here. Otherwise you'll cut in some grooves and it'll be more work to clean up. Once all the rabbets were cut, I used some blue painter's tape to dry assemble the drawers and then test fit them into the box. To create the poles, I first cut a groove into a stick of maple using a bowl bit at the router table. This will end up being the finger placement for the poles. From there I took my stick over to the table saw and ripped the piece down so that the rear width was equal to the thickness of the door. Then I cut those down into 2 equal 2-inch sections and 1 3-inch section. And since these cuts are so close to the blade, I just used my pencil to hold the pieces tight to the fence. From there I took the smaller pieces over to the bandsaw and cut the rear part down to the thickness of the drawer. Then I smoothed out the cut lines with a block plane and marked out a curve. Then I took the pieces over to the disc sander and sanded in the curve. If you don't have a disc sander, you could use a rasp or a bandsaw, or you could just finish shaping these by hand. Finally, I finished sanded the poles to 220 and rounded over any of the front facing edges. To attach the poles, I'm going to cut a notch into the top of the drawers as well as the door. So using a marking knife, I laid out the poles on the front of the doors. Once I had the height set at the table saw, I just cut 2 notches in and then removed the material between them. This is another one of those times to err on the side of too tight, because you can always go back and make the notch wider, but it's a lot harder to make it smaller. And I like to make one final pass, just holding the piece over top of the blade to make sure everything is nice and even. Then from there I can test fit each of the poles. Once I was happy with the fit, I glued each of the poles into their respective drawer fronts. I did mask off the area around the pole, just so I don't have a bunch of squeeze out that would be difficult to sand back. And to make sure the poles were oriented correctly, I checked them with a square. Once the poles had dried, I glued and assembled the remaining box parts. I opted to use blue tape in place of clamps since these pieces are so small. I was also careful to make sure I labeled my parts correctly so that I again got the grain pattern I was looking for in the final piece. Once I had the 4 sides attached, the bottom just dropped right in. Then from there I could place my maker's mark and get on to the finish. And for the finish on this piece, I'm using a penetrating oil because it's natural and it's plant-based, which makes me feel better about using it around our bread. Though I'll still probably let it cure for about a week or 2 before I actually throw a loaf in. And I gotta say, this is probably one of my most favorite / anxious parts of the entire project because it's so close to being done, but it still has a little bit of work to go. And speaking of a little bit of work, it was time to glue everything up. And for that, I'm using a glue with a long open time so that I don't have to rush through this process. This is also where finishing the piece first gives me a little bit of value because if I get any squeeze out here, it's pretty easy to clean it up. And reaching with sandpaper at this point could pose a problem. After a few solid wallops, everything came together nicely. Then I just popped on a few clamps. To glue in the center divider between the drawers, I just put a little packing tape on the edges of the drawers and used them to help center the piece. And that worked out great. From there I could glue in the magnets that would hold the door closed. I just drilled and popped in one small magnet into the door and created a little catch for the inside of the box that would attach to the door magnet. And I just did this with an 81-degree angle and it matched up perfect. Alright, and now I got a place to store our bread or any baked goods and a cool place for some jellies and jams. This was a really fun traditional woodworking project. So if you enjoyed this project and you want to see some more, check out this video next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you next time.